Gerontology is the study of the aging process and the problems that elderly individuals might encounter. Professionals in this field typically study and find ways to treat physical, mental, emotional, and social problems. Biomedical gerontology is a subdiscipline that endeavors to slow, prevent, and even reverse aging in both humans and animals. My guest today is Dr. Aubrey De Grey. In the field of aging research, there are those that look at the big picture of great ideas, and there are those that focus on specific ideas, and both are crucial to advancement. My perception of Dr. De Grey is that he is a true visionary and a catalyst in the field of biogerontology towards the goal of greater health spans. Dr. De Grey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
It's always good to see you. You and I have known each other for a long time, and as you know, I've been a big admirer of yours for a number of reasons. For your research, what you've done, and your courage in just taking hits every now and then as to what people saying that no, this can't be done and this is a fantasy, but through perseverance and time, so much of what you have said over the last 20, 25 years has really, if not come to fruition, has come to the point where people are saying, hey, this is really a possibility. Can you explain to our audience, in general terms, what you feel the difference is between age and aging? Because so many people saying that aging is inevitable, and perhaps there's a different perception that people have on those two very similar words.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that people in the expert community like to describe that distinction is they don't say age versus aging, they say chronological age versus biological age. So chronological age is obviously well understood. That's not a difficult thing to define. It's simply how long ago you were born. But biological age is a much more difficult thing to define, at least if we want to define it in a practically useful manner. If we don't care about whether the way we define it is useful, then it's fairly easy to define. We can say that it is the amount of damage that your body contains. And here we're talking about self-inflicted molecular and cellular damage that accumulates throughout time. When I say self-inflicted, I mean it's a consequence of the body's normal operation. So it starts even before we're born, and it accumulates. And the reason that it's appropriate to call that stuff, those changes, damage, is because the body is set up to tolerate only a certain amount of that before function starts to go downhill, whether that's physiological function or cognitive function. So so biological age is really just like how close you are to going downhill.
I think you've used the analogy a lot, is that we can purchase a brand new vehicle, but the moment we start using that vehicle, damage starts to occur. We might not notice it, but it occurs. And is that similar to the human body?
I believe it is. I believe that even though the analogy between living organisms and simple man-made machines like cars sounds oversimplistic, it's actually a really good analogy, because this accumulation, this creation of self-inflicted damage as a consequence of the normal operation is really not anything that's a function of biology. It's a function of physics. So in other words, it applies to non-living machines just as much as it applies to living ones.
So the idea of aging as the process of the consequence of living normally, that our body, in order to live, has to go through metabolism, how we nourish our cells, but in that process of normal metabolism, damage does occur. How is it that we can then think that we can go on and correct that? And I think that's going to get to the crux of what our talk is that do we need to stop that damage from happening?
So, in fact, that is rather the way that the field thought about the idea of intervening in aging 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And they basically came to the conclusion that it can't be done because the creation of damage is so intrinsically intertwined with the things we need metabolism to do to keep us alive. So, I mean, that's why the analogy with cars and airplanes or whatever is so good, because it shows us the answer. We've got cars that are driving around today that are literally 100 years old. They don't drive around very often because people want to look after them, but they drive around. And the point is they're working every bit as well as the day they were built. So we have to ask, how come? How did that happen? And of course, the answer is not that they were built to last 100 years. They were built to last maybe 10 or 15 years at the outside. And yet here they are. And the answer is simply that they have benefited from comprehensive, periodic, preventative maintenance. In other words, not the prevention of damage, which in the case of cars means basically things like rusting, but rather the removal of that damage every so often before it reaches the point where things start to go wrong, the doors fall off or whatever. So that is the exact same principle that I have brought to the problem of aging.
And that principle that you brought about many years ago now was not universally accepted when you first brought it in, and I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But it seems to me that you were able to come up with a strategy for healthier lifespan, and as a consequence of that healthier lifespan, a longer lifespan. And most people, when they think of, if not immortality, extended longevity, they think of certain plants, certain trees, maybe certain animals. A term that was coined, I believe, by Caleb Finch called negligible senescence. Can you explain what that is, and then how, from there, you kind of turned this natural process into a strategic process?
Right, yes. So, I mean, really, I kind of stole the words because there's not a lot in common between what Caleb Finch was talking about back then in 1990 or so and the kind of things that I do. But, yes, let's first of all define what Finch was saying. He was looking at the populations in the wild of various different species, and he was interested in measuring their rate of aging. Now, of course, in general, you can't do that by detailed laboratory analysis. You have to find some proxy, and the only really universal proxy that there is, or fairly universal anyway, is to measure how old animals are in the wild. Some animals, you can measure that quite accurately, depending on how they grow. And you can then just do a statistical analysis. You can ask, what proportion of the animals are 0 years old, what proportion are 1 year old, and so on. And then, in particular, you can work out the mortality rate. So if you divide the number that are, let's say, 8 years old, by the number that are 9 years old, or actually the other way around, you go 8 divided by 7, for example, then that's the mortality rate. That says what proportion of animals are dying at each given age. And if that proportion goes up, in other words, if the proportion that are surviving goes down, so like say the proportion that are 9 years old divided by 8 years old is less than the proportion that's 8 years old divided by 7 years old, and so on, then that's aging. You can say that there's an increased risk of dying as one gets chronologically older. So, of course, one can ask this question more accurately with larger populations, but some animals it's just impractical to look at particularly large populations. So what Finch did was he defined this term negligible senescence as the absence of any increase in that mortality rate to the extent to which we could actually answer the question statistically. So in other words, the absence of a statistically significant increase in the mortality rate. And, various animals appear to show this. And this is interesting, of course, because the question is, do they have aging at all? Is there actual non-senescence, or is it only beyond our ability to statistically identify it? And, of course, there's still plenty of argument about that. There are some mammals, certainly some vertebrates, who that appear to be not aging in this sense, as I just described. But most people think that they do actually age. They just age really slowly. Whereas there are other much more primitive animals, like hydra, for example, or certain jellyfish or such like, which quite probably don't age at all. Genuinely not. So that's what negligible senescence is. So I coined the term engineered negligible senescence simply to mean the process of medically transforming a species that has senescence into one that doesn't. And, it was a bit cheeky of me to use this thing because, of course, it's got absolutely nothing to do with the biology of the organism, that whether it ages in the first place. But, it gave me this nice, catchy acronym to use.
So when you came out with this, and I think along that same time, you basically made a very bold statement that it's certainly in the realm of possibility that humans can live for an extended period of time. And of course, everybody grabbed onto that saying, as if you're saying, like, right today that somebody's going to live to 1,000 years, which was not really what you were saying, but we have the capability and the steps to take one step at a time to get there.
Right.
But when you came out with those statements and came up with your definition of strategies for engineered negligible senescence, SENS, which is a foundation that you founded, how much pushback did you get from the gerontology community?
So I got lots of pushback, and it was at two different levels. One level was the question of, would it actually be practical to repair the damage of aging comprehensively enough to actually extend healthy life? Everyone in the gerontology community was perfectly well aware that at the end of the day, lifespan is a side effect of health span. In other words, if you're biologically young, however chronologically old you are, then you're probably not going to die in your sleep tonight. Whereas if you're biologically old, however chronologically old you are, then you've got a greater risk of dying sometime soon. So that was fine, that lifespan is a side effect of health span. But I took that to its logical conclusion, and I said, right, well, this damage repair thing, if you can do it at all, you can do it repeatedly. And therefore, there might be a time when we can postpone the health problems of late life by, let's say, 20 or 30 years. And if we get to that point, then, we can do it to people, and then 20 or 30 years later, we can do it again. And and this led me to this concept called longevity escape velocity, which I'm sure we'll come back to, which essentially is talking about how when you do it the second time, you probably need to do it more thoroughly. It's probably more difficult to do it the second time because of the types of damage that the original therapies that you used just didn't repair. But that's okay because you've had all that 20 or 30 years to improve the therapies. So you can kind of stay one step ahead of the problem. And so that's what led me to the prediction that people alive today have a good chance, or at least some people alive today have a good chance of escaping the health problems of late life indefinitely, however long ago they were born, which leads necessarily to the conclusion that such people will live a ridiculously long time, like 1,000 years. And of course, my colleagues in the community, first of all, they had trouble with the damage repair concept in the first place, but they had a huge amount of trouble with the implications in terms of longevity because they felt that it made the field look unscientific to people who weren't really listening to the logic. So I had a lot of pushback, absolutely.
I think there's a quote by George Bernard Shaw that says, "There are those who look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." And I think that you kind of like looked at this field from just a different perspective than most, and
Right.
the resistance you had must have been, pretty difficult to deal with in that at that time.
So first of all, Shaw said that in a couple of ways, actually. Another way that he said more or less the same thing was, he said, the reasonable man adapts to his circumstances and the unreasonable man tries to change his circumstances. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. And I wrote an editorial in my journal about, I don't know, 15 or more years ago, whose title was Long Live the Unreasonable Man. But yes, no, it wasn't difficult for me. And the reason it wasn't was because I had at least a crude understanding of the history of science. And that, big paradigm shifts are always difficult to sell. They often take a lot longer than it actually ended up taking me to get this whole idea to be accepted by the mainstream. So no, I didn't find it hard, I didn't take it personally or anything. I just carried on, engaging my colleagues and basically embarrassing them into trying to tell me what was actually wrong with my ideas and showing that they were mistaken. So it wasn't so hard as all that.
I want to take a step back for our audience for a second and really explain what you're talking about. You aren't necessarily focused on living to 100 years, 200 years as we decline in health. What you are looking to do is to battle the ravages of aging. And those, as you have explained many times, include Alzheimer's, include cancer, include arthritis, include sarcopenia, or the frailty as we move forward. And I think that that's a very important point to touch on, because living longer for the sake of living longer doesn't seem to have a whole lot of appeal other than the fear of dying. Mm-hmm. But that's not what you're espousing here.
Well, that's right, yeah. It has been, for a very, very long time, a widespread misconception that the attempt to postpone aging is precisely what you just said, the attempt to keep people alive even though they're in a bad state of health as a result of having been born a long time ago. This is so common that it's actually got a name in the sociology literature. It's called the Titanus Era, which is named after a Greek myth. But no, of course, it's not the case. In fact, not only is it not the case that I would want to do that, or that any of us in the field would want to do that, it's also not the case that there would be any chance of doing it at all, even if we did want to. Because the fact is, any machine, like going back to the analogy with man-made machines, any machine that is seriously damaged is at high risk of ceasing to function at all. And therefore, one can only postpone and keep people alive as a consequence of keeping people healthy.
So when people talk about life expectancy and the changes in life expectancy, 200 years ago, life expectancy was what? In Europe, I think it was in the 30s or 40s?
Yeah, low 30s.
Yeah, and people might say, well, look, we've improved our life expectancy, but why has life expectancy improved over the years?
Yeah, so of course the overwhelming answer to that question, certainly the overwhelming answer until, let's say, World War II, was the reduction in the incidence of death at an early age, especially in infancy, because of course that happened as a result of the advent of modern medicine in the middle of the 19th century, the development of the germ theory, the realization that hygiene is quite a good idea, and of course subsequently the development of vaccines, antibiotics and such like. As these things became more, these practices and these medicines became more available and more widespread, so more and more people were able to avoid dying in infancy and to live longer. But this is just an average. And of course, in the industrialized world, that's basically done now. Virtually nobody dies in infancy. In fact, even in the developing world, the numbers are, they're catching up really fast. There's not a single country in the world now that has a life expectancy below 50. So, they're catching up. However, that doesn't really tell us anything about aging. We have had progress, of course, since World War II in the industrialized world, in life expectancy, that has arisen from reductions in the risk of death at older ages. But that's been quite a lot slower than what happened in the prior period when we were bringing infections under control. So, and that's more or less stagnated now. We've more or less reached a point of diminishing returns in most industrialized countries in terms of being able to push forward the average longevity until such time as medicines come along that do this damage repair.
So, life expectancy then is an average, taking into consideration those that die very young and those that may have lived for a long time, and even a couple of hundred years ago, people would live to 90 or something like that. Lifespan is what we're really maybe talking about right now, which is how long can a human live in a healthy way. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on record about 122 years is the longest that a human has been recorded to live. So you making that leap that we could live several hundred years is, had to have been pretty revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, and that's really why it caused such a controversy. It was basically just sticker shock. That it doesn't, people hear these numbers and they think, well, that's so obviously crazy that they don't even bother to try and understand the logic that gets me to that conclusion. And that was frustrating, but not surprising.
Well, let's talk about the logic that got you to that conclusion. So you looked at life in general, metabolism, right? And you looked at this incredibly complex system in the human body that people were saying, well, it's too complex for us to figure out how to change it. And you said, hey, we don't need to change it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We need to understand it and then understand its damages. How did you come to that realization?
Well, I guess a lot of it was because I was not originally trained as a biologist. I was originally trained more as an engineer. I worked in computer science for a long time. And so I just, as I learned more about what was known about aging, I thought about it. I just attacked the problem from a different direction. And absolutely, I came to the rather rapid realization that damage repair constituted a way of sidestepping our ignorance about how the body actually works. Because if you are repairing damage after it has been created by the body, then you don't need to slow down the rate at which the body creates it in the first place. So you don't need to interfere with the way the body naturally works. You just get rid of the damage every so often so that there is never enough damage to cause the pathologies of late life.
And that process of damage occurs with breathing, occurs with living. Everything that we do creates that damage. You tended to focus on a number of different topics. It may be a little specific, but I'd like to go into it a little bit as to when the 7 areas that you felt were that we could categorize the damage of aging, because I think that's a huge step in what turned people around, because they couldn't dispute those categories that you came up with, and all of a sudden people had slowly a different perspective on what you had initially said when they realized, yeah, you know what, he's right. We can't figure out alternatives to categorizing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's important to understand the purpose of this classification. We certainly have always known that the human body is a ridiculously complicated machine, and it creates many, many, many different types of damage as a result of the actions of cells and tissues. But this classification is a way of grouping those many types of damage into a manageable number of categories. Now you may ask, well, what's the use of that? How does that help the problem? The answer is because for each category there is a corresponding damage repair strategy, damage repair paradigm, shall we say. And the specifics of how we address and repair the different examples of damage that exist within the same category, those therapies may differ, but they won't differ very much. Usually, just for illustration, I use the example of cell loss, which is one of the 7 categories I enumerated. So this is just simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. So, of course, this means that the number of cells in question goes down over time, and eventually there are not enough for that type of cell to do its job in the body. I often use Parkinson's disease as a good illustration of this, because that's caused by the death of a particular type of neuron in a particular small part of the brain. And, it's clear that if that cell death didn't happen, or if the cells were replaced when they died, then we wouldn't get Parkinson's disease. So what is the fix? The fix is, of course, stem cell therapy. That's what stem cell therapy is, basically. You inject cells into the body that have been prepared in the laboratory into the right state so that they know what to do to divide and transmogrify into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. Now, of course, there are other areas of the body where cells are lost, like, for example, pacemaker cells in the heart, or cells in the thymus, which is a very important organ in the immune system. And here, the type of stem cell therapy that we would need to do would not be the same. But it would be substantially the same. In other words, all stem cell therapies do have a lot in common. And the way that you create a particular type of stem cell these days, with induced pluripotency and so on, that is, again, a very generic thing. So this is useful because it means that once you've ironed out the kinks and got a couple of therapies, a couple of stem cell therapies working for a couple of aspects of aging, then getting the next one working and the one after that is going to be a lot easier and quicker because you can reuse the knowledge that you acquired in the first place. That's why it's so important to have this classification.
And so many people have heard of stem cells, although maybe not have a tremendous understanding, and many people may be skewed by the hyperbole that's out there of those people who are using stem cells in vivo now rather than without a whole lot of science behind it. But replacing cell loss is one of the aspects that happens to us or cell loss is what happens to us as we get older, and replacing that is one of those strategies. But in addition to cell loss, there are certain cells that don't die that we want them to die. And can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So 2 of the other 6 of my categories are related to that. And that's because there are 2 ways in which cells can be, you can have too many bad cells of some kind. And those 2 ways lead to 2 different strategies. So again, it's coming back to having corresponding paradigms, corresponding generic approaches. So one of the ways in which this can happen is if cells become cancerous. In other words, if they start dividing when they're not supposed to. And of course, people have been trying to do something about cancer for rather a long time. Difficulty is that cancer cells end up being very unstable genetically. So they constantly undergo selection, essentially evolution at the cell level, that allows them to be very powerful in escaping from both the anti-cancer systems that the body has naturally and also from those that we might apply as doctors. So I've always been focused on looking for extremely universal anti-cancer approaches, things that the cancer just won't be able to escape by, in some way, masquerading as a non-cancer cell. So the cancers are very good at that. That's why I focused on the telomere a lot, on the ends of chromosomes, which get shorter when a cell divides, and if that were to happen in cancer cells, we would never die of cancer, because basically the cancer would just divide itself into oblivion way before it became big enough to kill us. Unfortunately, they have a trick. They turn on a gene called telomerase, or at least 90% of them do. There is a way to stop that happening by essentially using gene therapy, but it's a very elaborate way. It's very tricky to do, and it was always the the aspect of SENS that I acknowledged was the most challenging. But now it's looking actually in recent years as though it might be a lot easier than I thought, because a group in Texas that I happen to be friends with developed a brilliant new drug that essentially kills cells rapidly when they make high amounts of the enzyme called telomerase that extends the ends of chromosomes. And this drug is now in clinical trials. There's a phase 2 clinical trial just recruiting right now by the company that they spun it out to in Chicago. I'm extremely excited about that possibility. The other thing I'm really excited about in relation to cancer is cancer immunotherapy. Of course, I'm not the only one. There are there's been huge strides over the past decade in developing, in particular, these things called CAR T cells and also checkpoint inhibitors, which have had great success in some cancers, and there's plenty of research going on that's looking pretty promising to broaden the applicability of such treatments. So yeah, the future's fairly bright with cancer, I think. So then let's move on to the other type of cell that we'd like to get rid of and the body doesn't get rid of it. They are called senescent cells. Or actually, I use a slightly more generic term. I call them death-resistant cells. So these are cells that are not dividing, but they are toxic. They are secreting stuff that is bad for cells around them. And the body tries to get rid of these cells as well, and it mostly succeeds. But some of these cells become resistant to being killed off. And so we need ways to fix that. And that's an area that has seen a great deal of success over the past decade, essentially as a result of some clever experiments with genetic mouse models, which showed that if you could kill these cells, then lots of good things would happen in an old animal, an old mouse. Then there was a good deal of success in identifying small molecules, actual drugs that could preferentially kill these cells. That's still a bit fragile, and we need a lot more work on that. There's definitely problems of reproducibility of a lot of that work, but everyone's trying really hard, and it's going well. So yeah, again, this is something which, when I first was talking about it 20 years ago, it looked like a long way away, but not anymore.
So we've got, on the one hand, cells that we want, and they don't replicate enough, we lose them. And on the other hand, we have cells that we don't want, cancer cells or the death-resistant cells that some people have labeled zombie cells that just sit there, cause damage, don't die, and are toxic to the surrounding environment. But the key that we figured out is that it's not one treatment for both of those two categories. People said, "Oh, we want to let our telomeres, go on forever and ever with our cells that we're losing." Well, that has negative consequences for cancer. Mm-hmm. So we have to have different approaches, and that's what you've kind of like focused in on.
Exactly right. Yes. Some people would say that if you want to summarize what aging is, it's a kind of trade-off between cancer and everything else. Cancer is, excessively regenerative cells, and everything else, kind of compensates by dialing down regenerative capacity as we get older. And we need to use medicine to find the best of both worlds.
So let's talk about some of the everything else. We've talked about damage within the cells, but you've also categorized damage outside of the cells.
Yeah, so I haven't really...
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I haven't really even talked yet about damage inside cells. We've just talked at the cellular level. So really we need to move on to the molecular level if we want to understand the other categories of SENS. So one category that I've always thought is very important is mutations in the mitochondria. These are these machines in cells that basically perform the chemistry of breathing. They combine oxygen with nutrients from the diet in order to extract energy from those nutrients that the body then uses to do everything else. And mitochondria have their own DNA, and it's a very bad place for DNA to be. Basically, this DNA mutates and accumulates mutations far, far more rapidly than the DNA in our normal chromosomes in the nucleus of the cell. The approach that we've been pursuing for a long time now is a very ambitious idea to put the mitochondrial DNA in bits into the nucleus, to put copies of it into the nucleus that will be modified in such a way that the proteins that they encode will be re-imported back into the mitochondria in order to do their job. If that happens, then mutations in the mitochondrial DNA don't matter anymore because the proteins that are normally synthesized from that DNA will be synthesized elsewhere. And the reason this isn't completely science fiction is because mitochondria naturally do exactly what I just described for well over 1,000 other proteins. And there are only 13 proteins encoded in the mitochondrial DNA that we want to kind of do the same thing to. So it's looking like, I mean, people have always known that it was an extremely ambitious idea. It wasn't originally my idea. It was first put forward in the 1980s, and most people just gave up on it. But we've made really good strides over the past, especially over the past 5 years or so, and we're far closer to getting this to work than anyone would have believed a decade ago would ever have been possible. So we're pretty happy about that. And then the other type of damage inside the cell is simply waste products, just garbage that accumulates. The cell makes a huge number of waste products all the time as consequences of metabolic processes. And nearly all of those waste products are either broken down or excreted. But the reason that happens is because if it didn't happen, we wouldn't live long enough to have kids because they accumulate quickly. And it turns out that, unfortunately, there are a few kinds of waste products that do accumulate, but they accumulate really, really slowly, such that they don't actually cause any pathological harm until old age, which is the point where evolution no longer cares about us. So those are the things that we've been trying to get rid of. And again, there are really two approaches here. Either we can augment the body's ability, the cell's ability to break stuff down by introducing additional enzymes, for example, from other species, or we can enhance the ability of the cell to excrete and export this material. Both of those approaches have seen quite a lot of success over the past few years in projects that we initiated and have now been spun out as startup companies because they're close enough to the clinic that people who want to make money are willing to write checks. So that's really quite good news. But then you were asking about what goes on outside the cell. And there, yes, absolutely. The last two categories of SENS are outside the cell. One of them is the accumulation of waste products again. And the reason it's useful to view that as a separate category is simply that we can address it in a different way. Again, the damage repair is different. Here, the damage repair is very simple. We can just cause cells to internalize this stuff, to actually engulf it. Once we do that, bang, it's in the cell, and so it becomes the previous problem. And in fact, it's better than that, because the stuff that accumulates outside the cell is inherently easier to break down. You might ask, why does it accumulate at all then? And the answer is because the machinery that we naturally have outside the cell to break things down is far less versatile, far more weedy than what we have inside the cell. So just getting it inside is enough. And then the final one is stiffening, loss of elasticity of the lattice of proteins called the extracellular matrix that keeps that gives our tissues their biophysical properties. And this is important for cosmetic reasons, such as wrinkles, and it's also important for life-threatening reasons, in particular in the walls of our major arteries. So again, the goal is to try and deal with that. And again, we funded a project for a few years which did the early stages of figuring out how to restore elasticity, and that was again spun out as a startup company which is now well-funded and moving forward quite nicely.
So the thing that as you look at all this and these 7 categories of things that lead to pathology in the human being, it's on the one hand, it's very encouraging that we have this category. On the other hand, it seems very daunting to be able to handle these things. And someone might say, well, how can we really today expect to live longer when we still don't know so much about this? Mm-hmm. You've explained we really just need to live a little longer to be able to get some of the benefits of the exponential speed of how technology is changing. And then we'll see what happens from there. Tell us a little bit about how, when you have to explain to somebody how we ultimately can reach LEV, which we'll talk about a little later on.
Sure. Yeah, so I am always very careful to be quite, cautious in how confidently I say that some people alive today are likely to live to a very old age. I always say that there's a threshold level of progress we need to make in developing this damage repair, a threshold level of comprehensiveness of this portfolio of this panel of therapies, which will give us maybe 20 or 30 years of additional life, and which will give us the opportunity, will buy us the time to improve the therapies thereafter, to give us an extra 20 years and so on. And the question then is, how soon will we get that first 20 or 30 years? And honestly, I have to say, I do not know. I will say that it's important for people like myself to give some kind of prediction, but we have to make very clear to everybody that it's a very speculative prediction. So I always say that I think we've got a 50% chance of developing these therapies in a particular time frame. And that time frame, as of now, I'm saying 15 years from now. But I always emphasize as well that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years, because we just don't know what unforeseen obstacles we're going to encounter.
I think when we as a culture look at what we have accomplished in the last 15 years, 20 years, certainly the last 50 years, I mean, it's amazing how fast and how much we've accomplished compared to humanity before that. And we have to assume that we're getting doing things faster and faster. Things are getting smaller and smaller in the way we're able to technologically fix things. And we have a better knowledge of the human genome now than we did, 23 years ago, or whenever the Genome Project came through, and we were able to really look at that more closely. So I think we have the tools. But what do you see outside of the tools that we might have or not have, being the obstacles socially? Where do you think resistance comes to your research?
So, I mean, that's changed a lot over the past several years. I've already mentioned that a number of the projects that we initiated at SENS Research Foundation many years ago have now been spun out of startup companies. The reason that's possible is because there are now investors out there who, write bigger checks than donors do on average. And so, this was a way to do this. But there were no such investors 10 years ago. Absolutely none. And they came into existence simply because of the incremental amount of progress that was being made, both at my foundation and elsewhere, of course. So, I think people just look at the science, to the extent that they're able to, depending on how scientifically sophisticated they are, but they look somehow at the rate of progress and they just see, well, we seem to be getting there. I think that's the main thing. There's also, of course, the gradual realization that it makes no sense to make excuses for aging. People to say, oh dear, doesn't death give meaning to life? Or, where will we put all the people? Or won't dictators live forever? The kind of things that people tend to say. There's less of that now. The society seems to have generally acknowledged that aging really is a medical problem. I won't say that society as a whole has done so, but a much larger swathe of society has done that. And that's really all we need. We don't need necessarily everybody to be on side. We just need enough people to be on side to take things forward. So the obstacles have shifted. Historically, there's no question the biggest obstacle by far was money. That was the rate limiter. There just wasn't nearly enough money to do the research as fast as the science allowed. Now, it's largely the case that there is enough money. And we need, therefore, to make sure that we have the right people. There's definitely a paucity of talent in the field. Not necessarily just scientific talent, also entrepreneurial talent. There's a lot of professors out there who are seeing this shift to, this growth of private sector involvement in the longevity field. And they're thinking, that seems like a very interesting way to actually get money, since I'm not doing too well in trying to get grant money out of the NIH or whatever. And so they'll try to create a company, and they will fail because investors will immediately see that they don't know how to run a company to save their lives. But if they partner with someone who does, someone who has a bit of an entrepreneurial track record, even if that person is not particularly in the field, might not even have biology training, or at least not much of it, then it becomes a much more attractive value proposition. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen, and I'm putting quite a lot of my effort into promoting and realizing that kind of stuff.
As you know, the title of my podcast is Beauty and the BS, and people will wonder, why am I so interested in increasing health span within that category of beauty and the BS? But it drives me absolutely crazy when I hear people saying, I just want to age gracefully, because I just think that's such an oxymoron.
Yep.
And because aging is just frailty and cancer and dementia, Alzheimer's, arthritis, all these things that are just horrible, horrible suffering. And you, throughout the years, have tried to get that across to so many people that that's really what we're trying to fight here. And if in fact, we get a few extra years because we're able to stop the suffering of people dying in a painful, horrible way, so be it. But I think that when we talk about beauty, what we all want is we want to be able to have maintained cognition. We want to be able to ambulate and move around. We want to maintain a sense of aesthetic, that that our skin is healthy, and we want to be free of disease. So having this topic, I think, is so tantamount or so important to beauty, the concept of beauty itself, because unless we have a foundation to build it on, who cares what we look like on the outside, right? We have to be healthy completely. And just like age, or rather longevity may be a consequence of health span, external beauty will be a consequence of internal health as well. I think that that's something that has been really kind of the key of my interest in following you for all these years, because I think really you are the key instigator to get people to move in this direction. Now, there are a lot of people who are talking about, aging or anti-aging. That's kind of a weird term, anti-aging. What are your thoughts about that term itself?
Yeah, like so many terms in this field, it's got too much baggage. In a sense, you could say that the term is well meant. They're just trying to say, aging is bad for you, therefore let's fix it. But of course, the word aging has many different definitions as well, and we don't want to say things that could be interpreted as somehow undermining the dignity of the elderly. A lot of people are very, edgy about doing that. So yeah, we don't use the word anti-aging very much these days. It's more, the word longevity has kind of been rehabilitated, so to speak, so we can talk about that. And actually the word rejuvenation as well. So this damage repair, turning the biological clock backwards, what better word can there be for that than rejuvenation? But for the longest time, the word was kind of hijacked by cosmetics. People would think about only about cosmetics as a result in that context. So I'm very happy that's no longer really the case. There are companies or even academic conferences using the word rejuvenation properly, and that's very heartening. And actually, it comes back to what you were saying a moment ago about people looking good as a result of being good inside. That's totally true. The outside of the body is the easy part.
Right. It must be repeatedly asked of you, what can I do to stick around for another 10 or 15 years to benefit from the technology available in the future? And I know it doesn't take a biogerontologist to know that healthy diet, regular exercise are generally better than an unhealthy diet or sedentary lifestyle. But everybody wants a magic bullet, and they want it now. And there's been some in your field who will espouse a certain medication or a supplement regimen like metformin or precursors to NAD plus or resveratrol. Others will condemn regimens of having little scientific basis. You tend to be a little quieter in both praise and condemnation of current available regimens. So why is that? And again, is there any regimen that you believe in that may keep us healthier for a little longer until something new may be available to keep us longer or alive longer and healthier longer?
Yeah, so you're right. I tend to say rather little about that. And the reason is because my position is kind of intermediate. On the one hand, I do feel that it's great if people can extend their lives a little bit, their healthy lives a little bit, by doing the right thing, by whatever means that are available today. But equally, I always need to make sure that nobody gets too carried away with the magnitude of the benefits that could be obtained in manners that are available today, because the magnitude is really not very much. And when I say it's not very much, of course, I'm here talking about relative to the well-behaved default. In other words, relative to essentially living the way your mother told you to, and not smoking and not getting seriously overweight and having a reasonably varied diet, and that's basically it. Certainly, it's very easy to shorten one's life by deviating from that, but we're not comparing a bad lifestyle with the best possible. We're comparing a good but not innovative lifestyle. And I would say, my honest feeling is that nothing exists today that can substantially postpone the health problems of late life relative to living the way your mother told you to. And when I say substantially, I mean by even as much as a year or two. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't live the way their mother told you to, or shouldn't do what they can. Every little bit, every day you can postpone these health problems is worth it. But, I guess there are trade-offs there. If you're not getting much, then you might not. If it involves doing things you really don't enjoy doing, then there's a quality versus quantity aspect to it. So I don't like to be too didactic about this. That's really the answer.
You mentioned earlier that you didn't start out in this field. Tell me, you started out in computer engineering and actually in early phases of AI. Tell me how you went from there to where you are now.
Yeah, it was all because I married the right woman. Essentially, I was working in artificial intelligence research. I did my bachelor's in computer science. And during that, and it was going pretty well, this research. I was making good strides. But during that time, I met a biologist who was a lot older than me. She was already a full professor at UC San Diego. She was in the UK on sabbatical. And she decided to stay. And through her, I first of all accidentally learned a lot of biology over the dinner table, But eventually, after a couple of years, I began to realize that we were never talking about aging. And sure enough, it turned out that she just wasn't interested in aging. And none of the other biologists I was meeting were interested either. And this is something I had completely failed to consider all my life until that point, because I'd always known perfectly well that aging is quite obviously the world's most important problem, the thing that causes by far the most suffering, and that it is a potentially tractable medical problem. And so I had totally assumed that everybody else thought the same, and that biologists were beavering away trying to do something about it. And it turned out no. So I thought, well, that won't do. I'd better change fields. And I was in a good position to be able to do that. It just turned out. So yeah, that's what I did, and started having well-received ideas, and eventually I had this big idea about damage repair.
And from there, obviously, you went on and you founded the SENS Research Foundation, which has had praises from everybody in the field. You then wrote a book, which, if you look over my left shoulder, it's in the background there, for those who are watching this podcast, called Ending Aging, which is kind of a must-read for people interested in this, and something that I will always refer to when I want to sound smart to my friends. But now you've founded a new foundation called the Longevity Escape Philosophy Foundation. Explain that term and tell me what LEVF is doing now.
Yeah, so I guess I've done most of the explanation of the term already, but the idea is that, if we can postpone the health problems of late life enough to be able to keep up, in other words, to be able to improve the quality of these damage repair therapies as faster than time is passing, so that the same people who got the first generation therapies and got 20 or 30 years out of them can then be treated with second generation therapies when they start to, when they get back to being the biological age they were before the first ones, on account of the accumulation of damage that the first generation therapies were unable to repair. So if you can do that once, then you can definitely carry on doing it. We will be able to, it will become progressively easier to stay one step ahead of the problem. So yes, so I use the word longevity escape velocity to describe the minimum rate at which scientists are going to have to improve the comprehensiveness of these therapies in order to give that result. And of course it's got some analogy, some similarities to the concept of gravitational escape velocity, so that's why I use the term. I guess the point about the LEV Foundation is that I've always been the kind of person who likes to be at the tip of the spear in what I'm doing, and to take on the next step that most people still think, they haven't really got their heads around, they still think is like science fiction, and to show that it isn't. And the thing is, the stuff that I started doing 15 years ago or more with SENS Research Foundation, and that I described obviously in my book Ending Aging, is no longer the tip of the spear. It has become sufficiently mainstream that other people are running with these various technologies, and it's now time for us for some people, to be focusing on the next step. Let's call it the end game of rejuvenation, which is getting to this longevity escape velocity. So, that's where I feel my strengths lie, and that's why I've decided not only to name the foundation in this manner, but also to focus the activities of the foundation, a couple of steps ahead of what SENS Research Foundation is doing.
So as we are recording this podcast, we're coming up on 2023. What's next for Aubrey De Grey?
So, a new organisation is a lot of work, obviously. I am really busy right now initiating the major projects of the foundation, especially the flagship project, which will be a rolling research program testing combination therapies in mice that are applied to those mice only when they're already in middle age. This is something that is being done in I would say, a slightly too timid way by various other groups, so we're going to be doing it in a rather more, courageous way. So I bought 1,000 mice last week. I have to figure out what to do with them when they arrive. And so, yes, there's a lot of work going on at the moment.
Aubrey, I just, again, without being overly effusive about my admiration for you, I just want to let you know that I think that what you have done and the revolution that you have led will have long-lasting effects on us as a culture and humanity in general. And I think that you are one who is really will be looked back on in time as someone who really moved the positives of humanity in a good direction. And it's been such an honor to have you here. It's a privilege of mine to be able to know you, and I thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Well, thank you. You're extremely kind, Peter, and I, certainly I feel pretty good about the contribution that I've been able to make over the years to eventually saving lives, and obviously I want to carry on doing that for quite a long time to come. And so having people like you having my back is definitely, a big part of how I've been able to get here.
Well, you've got that, and I love having you, and thank you for being here. Hopefully, I can get you back one day. That will conclude this episode of Beauty and the BS in our special series, the Counterclockwise Revolution. We've had Dr. Aubrey De Grey. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to having you join us at our next episode.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody. The Beauty and the BS podcast executive producer is me, Dr. Peter Grossman. Our producers are Max Banta and John Largent, and editing and post-production services are provided by Game Day Media. You can listen to Beauty and the BS wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you would like to leave a comment or ask me a question, go to beautyandthebspodcast.com and click on the microphone icon, and we may use your comment on a future episode. You can also find our archives, video clips, and more on the website as well. Thanks for listening to Beauty and the BS with Dr. Peter Grossman.